In terms of as a medium, how do you, for you, how is sort of the comic book as a version or a medium, in terms of communicating ideas that around war and things that people tend to view as quite political. Why is that a sort of your medium of choice to communicate that kind of information?
Yeah, well, I started out as a cartoonist. I mean, as a kid, sort of as a hobby, but perhaps more than a hobby. And then I never thought of it as a way to make a living. And then eventually I, studied journalism, and that was kind of my real passion and love. I wanted to write hard news. I wanted to write prose. And just along the way, when I got out of university with a degree in journalism, I couldn't really find a journalism job that I wanted. Everything seemed to be really just hack work, so I felt I'd be doing my time until retirement. So I basically fell back on cartooning as a means of self-expression and started to make a very moderate living at it. But I still had this sort of journalism blood running through my veins, still very interested in politics, what was going on in the world, and particularly interested in what was going on in the Middle East. So I decided I'd travel there at some point, see for myself, and so as not to go as a voyeur, just to see for myself, I thought I'd produce something out of it, which is comics. And I never really had a theory about how it was all going to gel or why it was going to work. I sort of thought it would be commercial suicide, but I tried to keep it relatively organic. I'd come out of a traditional autobiographical comics tradition, perhaps you could say, and so I knew that I would be a character in these stories. In other words, I'd treat them as a travelogue. I also knew I'd be doing interviews. I wasn't sure how that was all going to mix up, but it sort of did organically. Now I'm much more, perhaps because of interviews like this and all that, you begin to have to come up with reasons why you do certain things. And as time's gone by, I've just become maybe a little more, I understand what I'm doing a little more. And I think comics just works really well as a means of communication of this sort of material. As unsure of it as I was at the beginning, I realize now that, the basic power is it's a subversive kind of medium. Because I found out whenever I've come back from one of these trips to Bosnia or to Palestine, people will ask me, so what was it like? And I will start to explain that, and after about 5 minutes, they kind of want to talk about what movie's playing at the multiplex. There's a limit to how much people can sort of take in the way I was presenting it, maybe. I realized when I produced a comic book, they were willing to read something like that because they thought it would be an easy entree into a complicated subject. Now, the subversive thing is you can pack a lot of information into a comic book. At least as much as in a documentary film. And in that way, it looks very appealing. For whatever reasons, people are very visual, and it's a comic, they think it's going to be easy, but there's a lot of hard information in there, and sometimes very affecting information, poignant sort of material. So it works, and I think one of the main reasons it works is that I think you can really just take a person where he or she is sitting in a chair and just drop them in a place. You can recreate that place. It's one person recreating it. I don't need like a set designer, or I don't need even a computer to figure out all that stuff. It's like one person just recreating what that was like, and I think that's partly why it's effective.
In my own experience it's been in Latin America, mostly in Guatemala and El Salvador and southern Mexico, and there's a lot of literature that's similar to yours in terms of style, in terms of using comic book forms of communicating ideas about globalization, about trade policy, about civil war kinds of things. I think in part because there's awful lot of illiteracy that exists, so the visual medium is certainly more useful for a lot of the population, but seems to be very effective in terms of communicating these kinds of ideas and the importance of it. Do you see that there's because we're sort of living in this kind of internet age, particularly in the United States, do you see that is there a kind of a growing interest in the kind of work that you do or the medium that you use? And do you see that there might be any trends in the future about how people use sort of non-electronic mediums to communicate ideas?
Well, I mean, the growing trend is that sales are up across the board for what are called graphic novels, what I still call comic books. That's a relatively recent development, and I think a lot of that has to do with the quality of the work. There was always good quality comics coming out, but for some reason at one point it seemed like there was almost a critical mass of things coming out, and we, my peers and myself have sort of benefited from a lot of doors that were opened by other cartoonists that came before us, but we're kind of the beneficiaries of it. And you know, the work is good enough that editors sort of have to take note. And what's sort of happened is editors have grown up with comics, been a little more open-minded. They've been younger. They're my age or younger, generally, the people who are sort of taking over. I've dealt with editors in their 70s or 60s who are sort of intrigued, but it's not a safe bet for them. It doesn't really make sense in their world. Those people are being replaced by younger people who are open, it's just, you know, it's benefited me, certainly. 6-7 years ago, I couldn't have gotten anyone interested to fund my trip to Bosnia. But recently, when I want to do something, I have magazines contacting me or agreeing to pay and all sorts of things. So it's definitely changed. I mean, there has been a real change, and I assume it's going to continue to change in a positive direction, unlike the rest of the book market, which seems to be sort of falling. And I think that is because of the visual nature. And I don't even necessarily think that's a good thing. I love prose books. I don't want to see that form die. I think I spend most of my nose is in a book. I mean, a prose book usually, not even a comic book. So I certainly don't want that to go. I certainly get a lot of my information from prose books. But it is a visual world. It seems to be becoming more of a visual world with the internet and all that. So I'm the beneficiary of it. I don't know if the overall trend is a healthy trend, but I am the beneficiary of it.
Last night in your presentation, you talked a bit about you know, why you choose to put yourself as a subject in your work, and you told a story in particular about how it sort of helps you to confront your own biases in some ways. You told a story about being in a taxi, I think with a Palestinian woman, and sort of what lesson you learned from that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about sort of why you choose to put yourself in your work.
Well, first of all, again, there was no great theory to that. I just come out of an autobiographical tradition. So when I thought about doing comics about the Palestinians, I automatically thought, oh, well, I'll just tell my experiences. I didn't think in terms of some grand didactic, you know, exposition about it. I just thought, okay, I'll just tell what I've seen and how my encounters with people. Then I realized there was an advantage to that, and that was it does tip the reader off to the fact that they're seeing things through your eyes. It is not an objective form of journalism. I've sort of thrown out, for my own work, I've thrown out the notion of objectivity, which is I say objectivity is different from honesty. I mean, there are two different things completely. Objectivity to me is it's like a tennis match, sort of, you know. This side gets to serve and that side gets to serve, and the viewer is kind of doing this. It's like a game of Pong or something, whatever, you know. I don't like that. I think sometimes one side needs more of a voice than another side to balance it out. I make that determination because I'm a political creature with political thoughts. I'm comfortable making that determination, you know. What I mean by honesty, though, is if you see things that don't square with your notion of what things are supposed to be, you should report it. I feel like I'm an honest reporter in that way. So if I'm dealing with the Palestinians, who I feel have been historically very badly wronged, and I hear things or see things that I feel would not go over well with a Western audience, I think, well, you know, unless this is some real aberration, if this is part of what people are feeling, I'm going to report it, even if it shoots them in the foot. That's how I view it. And you know, there are prejudices, and I think when you depict yourself, you are able to sort of have a conversation with the reader about your prejudices and their prejudices. And I think that's why I think the nature of objectivity is ridiculous, especially a Western reporter going to so let's say an Islamic culture. I mean, the idea that a Western reporter thinks of him or herself as objective is just ridiculous, because we all have our prejudices about how they have their society and what they do. So just admit it, and let's go from there. You know, and that's part of what I'm able to do by having things in the first-person voice. I've always been attracted to the first-person voice. I mean, George Orwell's work, even a lot of the British writers that write in The Guardian or The Independent. You know, I want to feel like I'm having a conversation with a reporter across a table over a drink. I don't want to feel like someone telling me, you know, over the intercom system, I'm a fly on the wall and this is what I saw. And it doesn't, I'm neutral, I don't know one way or the other. This guy said this, I saw that, but I don't know, I'm not going to say. That's rubbish to me. Tell me something, you know?
And the thing that I found about your work that I think is really powerful is sort of the attention to detail you give to people, both not only in the stories that are being communicated, but even your drawings, that they're not just sort of, you know, kind of this, you know, cookie cutter sort of view of things. There's a lot of detail, and one of the examples you showed last night that I was really struck by was the series of drawings, I think when you were in Bosnia, of people chopping wood, stacking wood, storing wood, and just all that sort of attention to what's just for people there. That's their daily reality. This is what they do. So could you talk a little bit about just this, the importance of kind of trying to really humanize or, you know, look through the eyes of people who are in those situations, particularly of conflict, and how that's, for you, you know, why you've chosen, again, to kind of really focus on individuals and try to tell their stories as best as you can.
Well, I think it's hard to look at the general case of what happened to the Bosnians or the general case of what happened and is happening to the Palestinians and sort of affect a reader by talking about the general principle and 750,000 refugees and, you know, I mean, all those numbers are important, but ultimately they sort of pass over someone's head. I mean, there is 750,000 refugees here and there and everywhere. I mean, so what? What you have to do, I think, if you're going to communicate what that actually means and get people interested, is to communicate it onto the human level. That's why a lot of stuff that I think a lot of reporters ignore. You'll read like something about the Bosnian War, and a reporter will say, well, we got over the usual conversation about musical groups and stuff, and we went on, and then I asked these questions. And to me, I'm thinking, actually, I'm interested in the fact that they're interested in these musical groups. Why do they still hang on to that? What does that mean? Why do these girls want these pairs of jeans? You know, why are they sending me to Sarajevo looking for jeans? It matters to them to hang on to something that we might think of as silly, but it's not silly. It's they just want to be human. And those are the stories that I think you have to sort of recognize them and then sort of get out of their way and let them work with the reader. And I think that's important because you know, humanizing is the best way to get people involved. And I decided early on when I was doing the Palestinian series, even though, I mean, of course I'm sympathetic, I wasn't going to portray them as victim with a capital V, because they're not victim with a capital V. Oh yes, there's that aspect to it, but they resist, they try to go to school, they still get married. I mean, there's all kinds of things that go on that if you show it, you show them, these are people just trying to have a life. And ultimately, I think that's a good way to get people, you know, recognizing this, to be empathetic to those people.
Is your work on Palestine, are there versions of that are in Arabic by any chance?
I think I'm talking to someone now in Beirut who is trying to put me in touch with someone who wants to translate it into Arabic. It's funny, it hasn't been in Arabic, but there's a problem with the fact they read from right to left. So unless they sort of, I would have a problem switching all the images around. So I think the flow would be very strange then. I think they have to read it as an English-speaking person would, but just with Arabic in the captions. But it's been translated into a number of languages, but never Arabic. The Gorazde book has just got translated into the Bosnian language, finally.
And you also touched on last night on the new book you're working on, which focuses on the Gaza. But I thought it was interesting that it's not so much about what's happening now, but what's happened in the past.
That's
Can you
right.
speak a little bit more about who you've been interviewing and when you've been there, and kind of
Right.
a little bit about what sort of the theme is of this new work.
I was there, I made 3 trips, basically 3, maybe 4 if you count an earlier one, but basically 3 trips to the Gaza Strip in 2002, 2003. And I spent most of my time in Han Yunis and in Rafah, which are in the southern Gaza Strip. And partly the book is about, it's always about the process and who I meet when I'm there. So it's partly about the time I was there, which was a period of heavy home demolitions by the Israeli forces. So it's partly about that. But mostly what it is, I'm trying to investigate a couple of incidents that took place in 1956 during the Suez Canal crisis, when Israel occupied what was then Egyptian-administered Gaza for a number of months until the U.S. forced them out, diplomatically forced them out. So it involved setting the stage for why these incidents took place, and then meeting a lot of old people who remembered those incidents. And I guess I don't really want to go into what those things are, because, but in any case, it's about a lot of hard stories. Let's put it that way.
Sure. You mentioned last night when you were talking about that I think you referenced something you came across in one of Chomsky's books about that was maybe the last time that the U.S. sort of diplomatically sort of forced Israel to do something. And then you also talked about your own sort of, kind of growing up in this country where sort of your own indoctrination about who Palestinians were was pretty typical in terms of seeing them as terrorists primarily.
And the point about that was no one hit me over the head with that thought. It's just what I received from television. No one was sort of saying, Joe, Palestinians are terrorists. I mean, I did talk to people who'd spent time in Israel who had that opinion, but generally speaking, I got it from just watching TV, and not paying very much attention. But that's what you sort of get. It filters through into your head.
Sure.
I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's as somebody who monitors media, I mean, it's amazing how, getting back to this idea of objectivity, that U.S. media by and large, is, even though they're not being forced to sort of report on from the government on what's going on, particularly with Israel-Palestine, but it almost seems like, almost repeatedly from all the research that I've done and other people have done, that it tends to kind of represent kind of the Israeli perspective for the most part, which is pretty interesting, considering that they're kind of claiming this sort of position of objectivity, even though there seems to almost always be a clear bias.
Yeah, well, it's just basically rubbish. I mean, and it's rubbish. You look at all the presidential candidates except Nader have the same line about it too. I mean, it's the American administration. When I say administration, I mean Democrats, Republicans. It's everyone in the power structure and everyone in the media. I can't think of any issue quite like it, as far as this almost a lock on what is allowed to be said or how you have to say it. I think it's changing from below, little by little. I think it is changing from below. But so far, the people who have the power are still controlling the message, I feel.
A friend of mine commented to me last night that they were sort of somewhat surprised that there wasn't anybody there to kind of heckle you about maybe kind of coming from maybe more of a Zionist position. Have you ever experienced that?
Yeah, occasionally when I give talks. I mean, but really not enough to even for me to think, oh, I wonder what's going to happen now. I don't really think that. And usually my talks aren't just focused on that. And I don't feel I'm rabid in any kind of way. I feel I have very strong viewpoints, and I certainly feel like I can, well, not that it matters, but I feel like I can pretty much argue my viewpoints well enough. I've seen enough of it. But yeah, every now and then you get something like that. But it's never been so disruptive.
maybe just by way of wrapping up, because I know you need to go. You were talking about before you went to Palestine the first time. You were living in Berlin and doing posters for bands, and you've also done stuff for, I guess, record albums and covers and so forth. And you mentioned earlier, just in terms of talking with people and your trips, your travels, about the sort of the importance of, for them, music, what music they listen to, and why, and those kinds of things. I mean, I can relate to that in my own work in Latin America. I mean, how important and how much of sort of this is sort of interwoven with your own work in terms of like popular music or music that people that you meet in your work that they listen to, and how that sort of motivates them or creates a space for them to be more human.
Well, see, I mean, because I'm interested in music and bands and everything, I've never discounted that in other people. And I realize it's part of what makes us human is listening to music and following bands. It seems sort of trivial next to the bigger picture, like the wars and history and conflict. But ultimately, that is what, it's always what people are grasping onto, what makes them feel human in the worst conditions. And it's always that small stuff. I remember being in Gorazde where they hadn't, most people hadn't set foot outside of Gorazde for 3.5 years, and but some peacekeepers had brought in some magazines. They were very curious about these movies that they heard about. They wanted me to describe movies like what's that movie with John Travolta and all those people shooting, Pulp Fiction. Mm-hmm. They were interested in Pulp Fiction. They wanted to get sort of a rundown on what that was like. Mm-hmm. I understood that. I mean, they were under siege. They felt, as they said, we're tired of seeing the same faces. We have the same conversations. There's nothing to talk about. Without culture, there was like nothing. It's like culture is like the air you breathe if you're a younger person, even probably if you're an older person. We really discount it in this country, but it's kind of, it's what sort of makes life interesting. It's a commonality between people, and I'd never discount that sort of thing. Pop culture or high culture, you just can't discount it.
Well, I appreciate you talking with us, Joe. I know you're ready to go, but thanks again.
Oh, you're very welcome.